Right. Welcome to session 4. Is that what we're on? Or 5? 5. Session 5 of The Color of Food with Derrick Weston. We're so glad you could be here. As we do, I record this, we'll post it on YouTube. I track all the links. I will be your tech deacon for the evening, and then we post it on YouTube. Charisse usually gets it up on Tuesday or Tuesday or Wednesday, and then we put all the links in as well. So if you ever missed any of the links to books or videos and that kind of thing, we'll just put them in on the YouTube channel. And then again, recording. I'll open with prayer, and then we just turn it over to Derrick. And so I think just keep yourselves on mute until we kind of open up and have some more conversations, and then we'll just kind of continue on with our hour together. So let's have a quick word of prayer. So let's pray. God, for all the ways in which you nourish our bodies, our minds, our spirits, and our souls. As we learn about and reflect upon the ways in which food has impacted not just our bodies, but the bodies of so many, and for the ways it has intertwined and woven into our culture and our communities, we ask for your guidance. We thank you for Derrick and what he brings into the space, not just in the knowledge, but in his personhood and how he speaks of things he loves. For all who are gathered here, give us open hearts, minds, and souls as we continue to learn together. We pray all this in the name of Christ. And God's people say,
And
Amen. All right, Derrick, it's all you.
all right, thank you very much. I'm gonna go ahead and I need permission to share. Um, we are having a little bit of it's hot here in Baltimore, not nearly as hot as what's going on in the Pacific Northwest. But more importantly, we are post cicada now, which is really been lovely to walk outside, not hear that constant car alarm sound, not have the constant crunching under my feet. So really excited about that. So I'm gonna go ahead and start right here, play from the current slide. We're going to talk a little bit about junk food. If you are like me, at least one of your favorite foods is on the slide right now. Um, uh, so I felt like this was a good text to start this conversation. And mostly because it's one that's not read a lot. It's not read very often at all. But this is Ezekiel, and he's talking to the people of Israel, and he's uh, basically telling them why they're going into exile. This is why things are going to get bad for you, and basically telling them that the things that they have done are worse than some of the things that other cities and other nations have done before them. And Ezekiel says this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and the needy. And I think this passage is important for a couple of reasons. One, that the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is oftentimes used as one of those clobber passages for the LGBTQ community. And I think that it's important to understand that what's going on actually in that passage is about hospitality um, and the lack thereof. But more importantly, I think it's important for our context to look at this scripture and say, um, we aren't lacking food in this country. We're there are not food shortages as much as people would like to scare us into saying that certain foods are currently having shortages. We don't have a shortage of food. When we have problems in this country, they are supply issues. They are getting food to the right places. But more importantly, what we have are access issues. We have some people having access to good food, healthy food, nutritious food, and others of us not having that same level of access. Um, So this is a person whose writing I love, Michael Pollan. He wrote The Omnivores Dilemma, which was huge for a while. I actually like some of his other books better. Second Nature, which is about gardening, is a favorite of mine. In Defense of Food, I think is better than The Omnivores Dilemma. Cooked is also very good. And I want to share a little piece. This was when In Defense of Food came out, which I think was maybe, ooh, I'm not going to guess actually. And he's speaking to the staff at Google. I guess Google invites speakers in to come in and talk about their products or their books or whatever. And so he is in this clip. He is speaking to uh, uh, room full of Google staff. That is only important because it sometimes feels like he is tailoring what he's saying to tech people, like referring, like kind of out of nowhere referring to things as algorithms. But other than that, is not all that important. So I want to take a moment, listen to Michael Pollan, and then we'll come back and talk for a second.
In the era of science.
Hold on, let me back just a little bit. And we'll start here.
What I'm suggesting is that right now, and until the science gets a lot better, the scientist cannot guide us in our eating decisions. So the question then becomes, who can guide us in our eating decisions? It's not me. You don't want a journalist telling you how to eat either. So I went looking, though, for my own guidance, and I gave a lot of thought to, well, how have people navigated this question of being an omnivore, of all these different foods, some of which are really lethal, in the past? And of course, we have had guides before. Science is not our only guide to the natural world or to our biology. We also have this wonderful set of tools we call culture. And culture has been greatly undervalued in the era of science. But still, I believe, is a repository of terrific wisdom. Now, culture and food, let me take you back to a state of nature, countless eons ago. And to give you a sense of how culture helps you navigate a food decision. Way back when your distant ancestors were in the state of nature, they are omnivores. They eat lots of different things. They don't have their eating decisions programmed by genes the way cows do. If it's grass, it's food. If it's not, I don't eat it. Or koala bears. If it's eucalyptus leaves, it's lunch. Otherwise, I don't know what it is. So they have this, they're hardwired, and it's really easy for them to eat. And they have really small brains as a result. Big stomachs, small brains. We go the other way. We have a rather small digestive system, but really big brains to help us, because you need a lot of cognitive equipment to sort out this very interesting, risky landscape. So you're in your band of fellow humans in the state of nature. Somebody bends down, picks up a mushroom, tastes it, keels over, and dies. The other humans say to themselves, we've got to remember this. We need some kind of mnemonic device. This mushroom is really bad for you. What can we do? Well, we have this thing called language. We're using it right now, and it's working. Why don't we give it a name, a really memorable name? Good idea. Let's call it the death cap. Who would eat a mushroom called the death cap? And so they named that mushroom the death cap. And for countless generations since then, people have stayed away from the death cap. People who knew the language stayed away from the death cap. So this is, in a proto form, this is how culture helps us. It helps us remember. We learn from the trial and error of our ancestors what to eat. And cultural wisdom is encoded in cuisines. The combinations of food, the fact that in Central America, people eat beans with corn. Just so happens it gives you the exact combination of amino acids you need to have a complete protein. That was a kind of wisdom encoded in culture. Culture is cuisines also. Culture is what your mother told you. Culture is the wisdom passed down through generations that, you don't have dessert before a meal. You have a big breakfast. You eat this with that, not with that. So this is, what we've had for a long time, and I think we can recover it. So the second part of this, the last part of this book, is really an attempt to offer some distilled cultural wisdom. Tradition in food is not just hoary old conventions, okay? It's the wisdom of the tribe. And so what I tried to do is develop some of that. My advice for eating comes down to 7 words I give away on the cover of this book. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. It was a little alarming when I realized I could boil down everything I'd learned in 2 years to 7 words. And I was a little afraid to tell my publisher, it's going to be a really short book. But as it turned out, it's a little complicated to figure out, well, what is food? How do you distinguish food from the edible food-like substances that increasingly are filling the grocery store? And I spent 14 pages defining food. This is something that did not need to be done 100 years ago. But the fact is, so I have a set of rules in this book that should help you when you go to the supermarket or you're at a restaurant to distinguish the food from the edible food-like substances. So for example, I see one of my rules is, and this is very much rooted in culture, don't eat anything your great-grandmother wouldn't recognize as food. Now, your great-grandmother may not be around. She may or may not have been a good cook, but just imagine her with you when you're rolling down the aisle at the Safeway, okay? And she picks up, or you pick up, this box of Go-Gurt portable yogurt tubes. And she takes out of the box, there's lots of packaging. She removes this plastic cylinder, soft plastic. It feels a little like toothpaste. And she looks at it and like, how do you get this in your body? And then she looks at the ingredients. And now yogurt's a very simple food. It's milk with a little bit of bacteria. Voila, you have yogurt. But there are 15 other ingredients in that Go-Gurt portable. What are those things? She can't recognize any of those chemicals. You can't recognize any of them. Your first grader can't pronounce them. So that's not food. That's not food. Same goes, when she picks up that Honey Nut Cheerio cereal bar with the layer of synthetic milk, so you don't have to pour milk on it. You just can eat it in the car. She doesn't recognize that. Milk doesn't come in solid form unless it's cheese. So that's one rule. And there's a series of other rules that are equally, dumb, but they're really algorithms to help you. And if you run these algorithms, you will find yourself gravitating more toward food and away from edible food-like substances. Another very simple one is shop the perimeter of the grocery store and stay out of the middle. The perimeter happens to be where all the food that has been least fiddled with in the last 100 years still resides. I'm talking about fresh fruits and produce, meat, fish, dairy products. Now, there is the yogurt. The Go-Gurt is in there, but a couple have snuck in. But by and large, that is the real food. And the other stuff is in the middle. The stuff that's been heavily processed. The reason for that makes good sense. The stuff along the edge is perishable. It does what all food should do, which is to say, rot eventually. And so it needs to be replenished a lot. And so you want to be near the walls and the doors and the truck, the loading dock and all that kind of stuff. The stuff in the middle lasts forever. I have a Twinkie on my shelf in my office that I bought as a prop for a talk 2 years ago. And while I'm there on the phone, just kind of listening to someone talk, every now and then I'll reach over and give it a squeeze. And it's as soft as the day I bought it 2 years ago. Now, why is that? Well, what is rot? Rot is the other creatures we share this planet with, the molds, the bacteria, the insects, the rodents, taking an interest in our food and going after it, making a play for it. The molds are not interested in that Twinkie. Why? Because they're not stupid. There's nothing of nutritional value there. So that is another rule. Don't eat anything that won't eventually rot. That's a very good rule of thumb. The food that's most perishable is probably the most nutritious. So that's another. And there's a whole series, don't eat foods that have more than 5 ingredients, that have ingredients you can't pronounce, that have high fructose corn syrup in them. Not because high fructose corn syrup is necessarily any worse for you than sugar, but because it's a marker of a highly processed food. And because, do you know any chefs or home cooks who cook with high fructose corn syrup? It's strictly a tool of the food scientist at, General Mills or somewhere like that. So avoid that if you can. And best of all, get out of the supermarket. If you shop at the farmer's market, that's all food. your great-grandmother will recognize everything at the farmer's market. I mean, there may be some cultural differences that she may not recognize certain fruits or vegetables, but basically, that's all food. You can't go wrong there. You can't go wrong joining a CSA, subscribing to a farm, and getting a box of produce every week. And it's, it really does come down to eating real food. And also, though, I learned that it's not just the content of our diets that's important. It is also the form. It is the manners with which we surround our eating. And that gets to the next point, not too much. It's not enough to tell people, eat less. Nobody really understands that. What's less? What's more? But what I did was look at how other cultures navigate abundance, because we're not the first people in history to have to deal with the fact that maybe there's too much food around and it's all very tempting. And cultures have very interesting rules for this to make sure that people don't eat too much. One is small portions. Part of the French paradox, which, could be about the nutrients, but it could also be that they have small plates. If you go to Paris and look at the size of the plates, they're really small. The French, have a real taboo on snacking. Eating in the car, they think is disgusting. We eat a fifth of our food in the car today. So there are manners that surround food that are almost as important as what we eat. Another rule of abundance in Okinawa, they have a saying called hara hachibu. I'm sure I'm mangling the pronunciation. Basically, it means eat until you're 80% full. What a weird idea. I mean, how would you know it's 80% unless you went all the way and doubled back again? But so you do that once and see. But the very idea of stopping before you're completely stuffed is downright un-American. If you ask Americans, and psychologists have done this, how do you know when it's time to stop eating? They'll tell you, well, when the plate's empty, when the bag's empty, when the TV show is over. I mean, it's always some external visual cue that we use to regulate our appetite, which leaves us vulnerable to whoever's designing the portion size, whoever's advertising the food on TV, whatever, other people are, rather than listening to these signals we're getting from our bodies. And part of the problem with Americans is we eat so fast, and we are the fastest eaters on the planet just about, that there's no time. It takes 20 minutes for those brain cells in the gut to tell the brain cells up here, you're full, stop. And if you finish your meal in 10 minutes, that feedback mechanism isn't happening. So one of the other tips is eat slowly and don't eat alone. If you can, eat with other people. When we eat socially, we tend to slow down and we have time to get those visual signals. So I have a whole lot of, kind of rules of thumb, algorithms for eating in a way that will help you to eat less without even being aware of it. I also advise, don't get your fuel where your car does. Don't buy food at the gas station. That's all, right? Edible food-like substances, except maybe for the milk. Gas stations have become processed corn stations. There's high fructose corn syrup inside for you, and there's ethanol outside for your car. Get off you don't want to be on the same food chain as your car. So I've got, a whole bunch of those rules. And the basic idea, though, is to take back control over our eating from the corporations we have allowed to cook for us. Because that's really what's happened in the last 50 years. 50% of our food dollars go to food prepared outside the home. In the interest of convenience, in the interest of the seductions of food science, we are letting large corporations cook food for us. And we have learned, and we see it reflected in the state of our public health, that they don't cook very well. And by the way, your food service is an exception to this rule. I had a very nice lunch and a truly memorable cookie. But we need to start cooking again. And that's a very radical idea. Cooking and gardening have become subversive acts in this culture, right? We outsource those things to other people. I'm suggesting that we've given up a lot by doing that, and that we need to rediscover cooking, because if you're going to shop the periphery of the store, if you're going to shop at the farmer's market, none of this stuff is microwavable. You're going to have to do something with it. You're going to have to cook it. It's not really hard, and it doesn't really take as long as you think. I think we've been kind of bamboozled into thinking cooking is really complex and heroic, and you have to be an artist, because we watch these heroic chefs, and it's daunting. We say we don't have time, but we do have time to watch cooking shows. So even if we took that time And we've also, you will hear people say, I don't have time to cook, but it really pays to think, well, is that really true? I mean, we have found as a culture, all of us, have found 2 hours a day for the internet in the last 10 years or 7 years. Where did we get those 2 hours? Well, some of them, some of us are stealing it from our employers. That seems clear. And you guys probably know the exact numbers of how many people are doing that at work. But we took it a little bit from television, and we took it from the family meal, and we took it from cooking. And I'm saying we should give back some of it to cooking, that it's too important, and meals are too important to outsource it. Corporations will always cook with lots of salt, sugar, and fat. Why? Because we're hardwired to like those tastes. And for good reasons. In the state of nature, they're hard to find and really important and full of energy. But now they're really cheap in our economy. And it's the easiest way for a food manufacturer to seduce us. And so they load it up. And the fact is, those nutrients are making us very sick. So you want to, salt your own food, sweeten your own food, fatten your own food, and you'll do a much better job of it, even if you don't know how to cook. So it really is about taking back control. And the beauty of it is we have choices today that didn't exist 30 or 40 years ago. We are not dependent on the manufacturers. We're not dependent on the Safeway. We have beautiful farmers markets. We have CSAs. We have, there is this movement rising today of alternative food, local food. It's vibrant. It's the fastest growing corner of the food economy. So that this book, where I really do suggest people get out of the supermarket, focus on where their food comes from, buy well-grown food, grown by good farmers, because we know that food is more nutritious now. We've proven it. This would have been the manifesto of a complete crackpot 40 years ago. You would have had to be one of those health nuts who goes back to the land, grows their own food, goes off the grid. Now you can leave the Western diet without leaving civilization and eat better and enjoy it more too, because pleasure is a very important part of this. We should be eating for pleasure. We should be eating for community. And if we do that, eat real food for those reasons, health will follow. It will be a mere byproduct. It will be given. So I'm going to leave it there. And I would love to... All
right. I'm going to stop sharing. The chat was just blowing up. So I love Michael Pollan, love his work, love his writing. And there are some problems with Michael Pollan and his writing. And that's the next step here. So there's a book that has a series of essays. It's called Cultivating Food Justice, Race, Class, and Sustainability. And I want to read just a little bit. There's a little bit of a critique of Michael Pollan here. Feminist social scientists use the term positionality to refer to understanding that our lived experiences, particularly those of race, class, and gender, shape our worldviews. The food movement narrative is largely created by and resonates most deeply with white and middle-class individuals. For example, Michael Pollan's recently offered list of food rules, was 2007, is intended to guide consumers towards eating practices aligned with the food movement. However, when Pollan begins his first rule by telling us not to eat anything your great-grandmother wouldn't recognize as food, he ignores the fact that our great-grandmothers come from a wide variety of social and economic contexts that may have informed the perceptions of food quite differently. Some were enslaved, transported across the ocean, and forced to subsist on the overflow from the master's table. Others were forcibly sent to state-mandated boarding schools in which they were taught to despise and even forget any foods they would have previously recognized. And those who've emigrated from various parts of the global South in the past few generations may have great-grandmothers who saw the foods they recognized demeaned or even forbidden by those who claim their lands. Of course, it is not these histories that Pollan intends to invoke when he urges readers to choose fruits and vegetables over processed foods. But because of his privileged positionality, Pollan fails to consider the effects of race on food access and the alternative meanings his words may hold for people of color in the United States. In the same way, whites in the food movement often simply do not see the subtle exclusivities that are woven into its narrative. And so on one hand, I absolutely love Michael Pollan, think he's brilliant. And on the other hand, I 100% agree with this critique of his work and of his writing, that he's coming from a very privileged place and a very privileged point of view to be able to say some of the things that he's saying. So a different essay in this book actually kind of gets to the heart of some of these things that I think that Poland, probably I've heard him speak enough that I believe he knows these things academically, but like they're not a part of his shtick, right? They're not a part of his I'm talking to Google presentation, right? Um, so in this article, they're talking about the fact that during the 90s and 60s, large retailers made decisions that helped create food access problems and have unwittingly helped produce the food justice movement. So basically talking about how grocery stores made intentional moves that created some of the conditions of what we once called food desert, but now call food apartheid, and that all of those decisions were made. A lot of those decisions were made for strictly economic reasons, but a lot of them were also to just not have to deal with people of color. So let me go here. It talked about over the last 50 years, major grocery chains have sought suburban locations to accommodate larger stores, more parking spaces, and higher profits. Eisenhower, one of the researchers here, refers to this trend as supermarket redlining, or the process by which corporations avoid low profit areas. Consider the impact of food access on such decision making. In 1914, American cities had 50 neighborhood grocery stores per square mile, an average of one for every street corner. Mayo documents store design and industry changes that transform groceries from small neighborhood organizations to large chains. Just as some were rediscovering healthy food in the 1960s, grocers began following the migration of the middle class from the city to the suburbs. The Business Enterprise Trust indicated the attitude: it makes no sense to serve distressed areas when profits in the serene suburbs come so easily. So this was the thinking that has and continues to shape a lot of the food access issues in this country. That beginning in the 60s and 70s, that white flight included grocery stores, included those who were making healthy food access to cities. And it also included, before a lot of these larger stores moved out of urban centers, they bought up the corner shops, they bought up the mom and dad shops, and put them out of business, made them a part of their grocery stores, and then moved those grocery stores out of urban centers. So that's a big part of the issue here of how food apartheid got created, and how we're living with it right now. And this oftentimes has fallen on racial lines, that what we see is that good, healthy produce is available to white people, to white suburban people. Now, it also falls along class lines, because one of the places where we see food apartheid is in rural areas that are depressed, but oftentimes it falls along racial lines. So I want to kind of connect a couple dots here, and then because I think that this understanding of the devaluing and discrediting of the worth of Black bodies, Black and brown bodies, is important, not just for the understanding of the food apartheid system that exists that keeps Black and brown people from accessing good and healthy food. But it also explains a little bit of the environmental justice movement. The environmental justice movement kind of cohered around the well-substantiated claim that low-income people and people of color bear a disproportionate share of burden of environmental degradation. And we're going to listen to a man in just a second who talks about these issues. So food access is about the ability to produce and consume healthy food, while the environmental justice movement is primarily concerned with preventing disproportionate exposure to toxic environmental burdens. The food justice movement works to ensure equal access to the environmental benefit of healthy food. And what has often happened in the past has been that the food justice movement and the environmental justice movement have separated as if they are two different camps. And a lot of the work that we've been trying to do with the Food and Faith podcast has been to recognize that ecological issues, food justice issues, racial issues, they're all kind of connected and intertwined in ways that are really important and sometimes insidious in the ways that they work. So I'm going to do a very shameless sharing of my own podcast because I have no shame. Nope, not Michael Pollan. And I want to share this gentleman as Reverend Michael Malcolm, and he is the executive director of Interfaith Power and Light in Alabama. And he was on the Food and Faith podcast just last year. I think it was last summer and fall. And he was raised in the Atlanta area, moved to Alabama, and started doing this work around environmental justice and talking about environmental justice issues. So I just want you all to listen a little bit to Reverend Malcolm, and then we'll talk some.
Our communities, and then we found ourselves knee deep in soil, and so and that journey is diverse. It has looked very different for different people.
That's my co-host Sam.
And so, what was your journey from feeling a call to ministry to serving your community, and how did you end up doing environmental and food justice?
I like to tell this story because it pays homage to one of my heroes in the faith as well as in the movement. Which is Reverend Dr. Gerald Durley. Reverend Dr. Gerald Durley is the chair of the board for Interfaith Power and Light, but he's also a personal and dear mentor of mine. And Reverend Dr. Gerald Durley said this when I first felt this call to be in this aspect of ministry. He said, "How can I preach to them in the pulpit, shout them in my pews, but they can't breathe out in public?" And that in itself it compelled me, it quickened me even, and compelled me to get into this movement because I saw that we miss a huge part of ministry in ignoring the daily life of the people we serve. And I saw in that we have a tendency, or we do well rather, with looking up. So our worship services are spectacular. We do good worship, and I'll speak to the Black church experience that I've experienced in my lifetime. Listen, man, I grew up Pentecostal holiness. We shouted from the time we got in, and when I say shouted, I mean we screamed and hollered. and we danced. And man, you talking about some showing up sweating and snotting all over the place. I'm telling you, we did it and we did it large. And they're still doing it and doing it large. However, from the time we left the sanctuary to the time that we walked to our cars to go to our various destinations, many of us didn't bother to even look around us in that moment to see the communities that we worship in. And so our communities laid waste. God's house laid waste while we went to our completed and plush homes. I think somewhere in scripture it talks about that.
You might be right.
I don't know. I don't know it all, but I know a little bit. And I'm saying that I noticed that there was a huge discrepancy, and it called me to get into this work. And I was still pastoring at the time. And this work took over the parish ministry aspect. And I just saw this fully as ministry and still do.
So I want to, Sam, I'm going to bump up a question that I had here. Because I'm going to drill down on that a little bit. I also raised in a Pentecostal church, also raised in the Black church. Never once heard a sermon on climate change. Never once heard a sermon on the environment. How and with all of the issues of justice in the Black community, how do you, because you speak of environmental justice and climate change as our number one issue, with all the issues in the Black community, how do you bump up climate change and environmental justice as the number one issue?
Yeah, so let me digress. I don't see climate change and environmental justice as our number one issue.
All right, let me just pause right there and say that in one of his written articles, he did say that he sees environmental justice as the number one issue. And I'm not just a bad interviewer. He actually said that. So that's not just that I, had my information wrong.
In our society, our number one issue is racial injustice. All of the other things, all of the other injustices are exacerbated from its foundation, which is racial injustice. And so if we could solve the racial injustice issue, if we would even be willing to address the racial injustice issue, I believe that we could deal with the other issues. If we could stop the pollution in Black, brown, indigenous, and poor white and rural communities, we can heal the planet. If you look at it, when coronavirus first, we went on lockdown, there were places that had never seen daylight or seen the air, sky in some people's lifetime, that it cleared up. So what I'm saying is the planet can take care of itself. We need to help the people. And if we continue to ignore the disparities in certain communities because they don't look like us, or because we've been taught that they are irrelevant, or that we've been given this myth and believe this myth that somehow these people can take more than other people can. Until we equally distribute land use, then we will continue to have these problems. And if we really look at the irregularities or disproportionate land impacts, we know it's driven by consumerism. So we would then curb our behaviors, and all of it falls in place. But we've got to solve this issue of othering the other. I'm sorry if I went the long way around.
No. That was not at all. Not at all.
Yeah.
That's exactly where it needed to go.
Yeah, and so for me, environmental injustice has everything to do with racial injustice. In fact, if you look at the history of environmental injustice, and Sam, you appreciate this because I'm gonna help us to be even more UCC centric.
There we go.
When environmental injustice or environmental justice came to the forefront, it came to the forefront based on a report that the UCC published back in 1987. Reverend Dr. Benjamin Chavis, Sister Vernice Miller, Travis Miller, as well as others came together, and they found out, they did a survey on land use and waste, and they found out that the bottom line, or the most common factor for disproportionate land use and hazardous waste facilities had to do with Black communities. They were disproportionately located in Black communities. And here's the thing, it didn't matter the income. That was what was crazy. Wow. You would think that it was poor, just poor Black communities, maybe, or even rural Black communities. No, middle-class Black communities have also, if you are Black 5 to 1, you are located near a hazardous waste facility or some industrial pollution, and it doesn't matter the income. Again, we've got to solve one issue and address that one issue. And if we ignore that one, you can't have environmentalism without dealing with environmental justice. But understand that the term that was used in that time was environmental racism. Mm-hmm. It was then changed to environmental justice because people weren't comfortable with environmental racism. Mm-hmm. Now we've gone from environmental justice, because people weren't comfortable with that, to climate justice. And so each time you move the resources from the people that are actually that are directly impacted. Each time you change the terms, you move the resources, because you move the focus.
So I just want to shine a light on this, because I think this is that statement you just made, I think, is one of the more important things I've heard as we've done these interviews. So we always, and speaking as a white person, one of the stories we always tell is that racism would be solved if we would just, if we could just improve the economics, if there was simply more money, all that kind of stuff, we could sort this out. But you're saying that economics, that finances make no difference in how environmental injustice affects Black, Brown, Indigenous, and minority communities at all?
None whatsoever. Yeah, not Reverend. I'm laughing because Dr. Bullard would probably kill me if he heard me. Dr. Robert Bullard, who's considered the father of environmental justice, writes on it in several different works. And he talks about how environmental justice or environmental injustice impacts those who are Black, and it has nothing to do with income.
And that just, like I said, that torpedoes, a story that we regularly hear. And so it does speak to, these aren't just economic issues, though economics are certainly involved, and we can talk about that, later, but that racism is really at the heart of so much of what we're dealing with environmentally. And that is profound.
But I mean, Sam, understand that racism is economic.
And absolutely. That, without question. Yeah, but we often want to separate these things. Well, there are economic issues over here, and there are environmental issues over here, and we deal with these things in pockets or in pieces. And you're saying that all these things, and anyone who's involved in food and environmental justice discovers these overlaps. And you're simply reminding us of the fact that injustice, I mean, it's the words of MLK, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. These things are always overlapped, and they are always intersectional. And that really seems to be a hallmark of your ministry, this intersectionality.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I really believe in order to heal, you've got to look at the whole person. And I think that we would all benefit from interdisciplinary or an interdisciplinary approach to injustice issues. Reverend Leo Woodbury, who is I call him my EJ pastor. He is my dearest mentor, my primary mentor in this work. And when I first got into this work heavily, he took me on the Justice First tour, where we went throughout the Southeast and wound up going throughout the South and even nationally with it. Where we talked to different organizations, different groups who worked on different injustice issues. So we'd have LGBTQIA groups, we'd have environmental groups, we'd have groups that worked on criminal justice issues, we'd have groups that worked on economic justice issues. Or community development, and we bring them all together and we start having conversations on what it looks like for all of us to operate outside of silos, support one another, and take a holistic look at justice issues to see how it connects and impacts, so we can help each other to fight. And I think that is what we need to do. And what was amazing about that, and what it taught me, is the validity of faith communities and that faith voice in that conversation. What faith does and what faith leaders do is they take that conversation and move it to an arena that says, is this right or wrong? And it moves outside of whether it's politically expedient. It even moves outside of the arena of it being economically feasible. And it asks the simple question, is it right or wrong? And that's where we come in as faith leaders. That's where we come in as communities of faith, because we are supposed to hold that mantle, and we're supposed to hold that measuring rod and say, well, is this according to the way that Spirit set up or God set up, versus is this the way that we just want to be? And if I understand the prophetic tradition, it always called out us operating according to just the way that we want to be.
So I'm going to stop right there. I have thrown a lot at you tonight, but I wanted to first off, Reverend Malcolm was just a really wonderful, wise voice. Really appreciate him. He also got dressed to the nines for a podcast interview, which I really appreciated. But I love his there's a lot of things about that interview that I love, but particularly where he ends, that it's so important that the faith community is involved in these conversations, because, you know, as Dr. King said, it's not our place to be the master of the society or the servant of the society. It's our place to be the conscience of the society. It's our place to ask the questions of a thing's rightness or a thing's wrongness, not if it's expedient or if it's economical, but like, is it right or is it wrong? Is it what God would have for us? And I think into these conversations of food justice and into these conversations of environmental justice, we can affirmatively say with confidence that the degradation of Black bodies is not what God wants, that the undernourishing of Black and brown people is not what God wants, that there is more toxicity and waste in the communities of Black and brown people is not what God wants. That it is morally wrong, and that it's important because, you know, I think there are so many people in these, and I don't have to tell you all this. You're in California. There are so many people in these environmental justice movements and food justice movements who want nothing to do with the faith community, who think that the faith community is absolutely obsolete in this conversation, absolutely irrelevant. And yet we have so many great resources to offer. We have scripture that was written in an agrarian society that speaks to the land, speaks to the importance of land, speaks to the importance of food. We have cultures and traditions of the ways that food and land intersect, and the ways that the care for land and the identity with land is just absolutely crucial to the identity of a people. And we have language of morality, of conscience, of compassion, of sin and injustice that help us speak, if we're able to and we're willing to speak authoritatively into these issues. So yeah, I threw a lot at you, and I continue to throw a lot at you, but I'm just interested in hearing the last few minutes. Any thoughts from any of the stuff, going back to Michael Pollan and then the takedown of Michael Pollan, and then Reverend Malcolm? Anything, any thoughts here that you all want to share, so I can stop talking? Yes, I see a hand. Evan, go for it.
Oh, you're still muted, Evan.
I went back to your opening comment about food deserts, and you didn't like that term, and I asked myself why after listening to the rest, and what replace it with. And I think in your conclusion just now, you're saying food desert is too narrow a way to look at it. And from a faith perspective, you're concerned with right and wrong and a compassionate approach. Those are the words I came up with instead. What do you think of that? And what would you add or replace those words with?
Well, I think that's good. I think that's helpful. And I stand on the shoulders of others who have said that food desert is inadequate because it's a research term that came from outsiders, and the term that people have started using now is food apartheid, because it understands that it's a human-made system. It's a human-made system of division and of power and of resources going into certain places with some intentionality. And so I've adopted that term, recognizing that like all the baggage that comes along with that term as well. But I think it more adequately speaks to the realities of the situation. We didn't record?
We did not record week 1.
Oh, okay.
Who
Yeah,
was the woman again?
I would, and if you need the link, I can share that as well. Her name was Karen Washington.
That's right.
And she is the woman she is the founder of the Black Urban Growers organization, and she is the one who coined and has popularized the term food apartheid, and really challenges us to not settle for the term food desert, because deserts are naturally occurring. Part of her argument against it is that deserts are naturally occurring, and that what is happening in our food system is not natural. It's created. It's made. It's manufactured.
I just had a minor comment. It's kind of a academic or semantic comment, I think, about the Reverend Malcolm. It came up in the chat a
your sound is
You're kind of garbled.
How about now?
Better.
There's something wrong with my headphones. Hopefully they don't spontaneously turn back on. So I was saying it's kind of an academic point, but something that the Reverend Malcolm said about the replacement of environmental racism with environmental justice, with climate justice. And, you know, I always think of environmental justice and climate justice as two different but related things. And I think maybe the point he was making, which we were chatting about, is that it's just kind of where people's attention is, and that it's like the supplantation of one for the next can kind of move the focus. But I think also where I sit, I feel like environmental justice is still very much in the conversation and, you know, alive and strong and growing and a lot of realms. But just curious about your thoughts on that. It seemed a little dismissive of the climate issue, and I was curious if you took it that way.
Yeah, and that's personally not what I hear him saying. What I hear him saying is I hear him coming from a people first perspective, and that can be interrogated as well. You know, I think we have to consider our relationship to the non-human members of our environment as well. But I think he's coming from a people first perspective on things, and so climate takes people out of the equation. The term climate, yes, people live in a climate, but but climate kind of takes the humanity out of the equation, whereas environmental racism, environmental justice, you know, keeps people somewhat centered. But I agree with you, and that because I think we have to not get caught up in words, but also examine and interrogate the words we use, because the environment should be cared for the environment's sake, and not just for the benefit that it gives to people. And we should care about people. And so there's always going to be that balancing act of these terms that we use, how we use them, what's appropriate when. But I really see that Reverend Malcolm's ministry is a very people-focused ministry, and he doesn't ever want to lose sight of the people who are being harmed by the kinds of things that IPL is working against, and the policies that IPL is working for.
That makes sense. Well, and one quick point too that I sometimes find myself reminding people is that if people don't have their basic needs met or are not doing okay, they're not going to care about climate justice. They're not going to join any movement. They're not, you know, like, you can flip that back and tell the climate people why people are important.
And IPL, I mentioned a couple times, IPL, Interfaith Power and Light, they are a national faith-based organization. They work with congregations doing things like energy inventories, so that you know how much like carbon footprint of your building and things like that. But they also, in places, I've seen it more in places like the South, they also do a lot of advocacy work. You know, a lot of marching when waste facilities are being located in particular areas, and things of that nature. So that's who IPL is.
All right, we good? Awesome. you all. Oh, I'm seeing Evan. Evan, you get the last
Evan
question. Go
is-
for it. Go for it, Evan. You got to unmute though.
I missed Reverend Malcolm's last name.
Malcolm is his last name. It's
Oh.
Michael Malcolm.
Oh, Michael Malcolm.
I have made that mistake over and over again in the months since I've interviewed him of calling him Malcolm Michaels or Michael Malcolm. That is Michael Malcolm.
So he gets for having two first names.
Yes, that's his own fault.
It's his own fault. All right, you all are wonderful. Thank you all for being here. And again, we'll put the links in the show notes on YouTube. Thank you, Derrick. We'll see you next week. Next week is I think a holiday for some people, but I don't know what holidays are. So, but we are on for Monday. So that'll be our last one. That'll be the 6th one, right, Derrick?
Well,
yes. What is time? What is time? I don't know what that is these days. So, thank you all. Have a good rest of the evening, and we will see you next week.
All right, good night, everyone.
All right, bye. Thanks, Derrick.